Hello, hello, hello. Hi. I'm gonna wait for people to trickle in for a second. Hi, everyone. Hello. Welcome. Welcome to all the amazing people here that are on our panel. Welcome to everyone who's tuning in from home. If you're here, obviously, you probably know that this is one of the many series, a part of Peace Over Violence's Denim Day series. This event specifically is dedicated to lifting the voices of the young, listening to the youth. And a Denim Day is a part of Sexual Violence Awareness Month, which is this April. And we're continuously trying to listen to issues that involve young people, which of course is teen dating violence, sexual violence, and we're trying to build relationships between adults and young people so those adults can be better allies. Before I continue, let me introduce myself. My name is Giovanna Tanku. I'm going to be one of the moderators here. I've been with Peace Over Violence for about a little bit less than a year. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am 17 years old. Our other moderator has also been here with me. But before I pass the floor to her, I do want to recognize that Peace Over Violence is built on Tongva land, which is Indigenous land. And if you know, Indigenous women specifically face 2.5 times more sexual violence within their lifetimes than any other group of people. So we can just take a time to recognize the land that we're standing on, Indigenous ancestors that we're standing on before we continue this event. Thank you so much for coming. And I'll be passing off to Yoko.
Awesome. I would love to add to that and say land back to Indigenous folks. It is because of white supremacy and American imperialism that so many communities in the US and overseas face sexual violence, and especially Indigenous people. So thank you so much, Giovanna, for mentioning that. I am Yoko Tamata, she, her pronouns, and I'm 18 years old. I'm so excited for today's event. Listening to the youth. We're here today because people in power have the ability to make a lot of change. It's just a matter of if they decide to listen to the public, which includes us, the young people. Before we move forward, I would love to make a content warning for mentions of domestic and sexual violence. So if you need to hop off, if you need to put the volume down, that's totally okay. And a reminder that it is because of ageism and stereotypes that youth are often excluded from participating in a lot of political change. But today we're challenging that with our 4 awesome panelists. 2 of our panelists are city council members, Nithya and Monica Rodriguez. But we also have people from the Youth Development Department. This department that is part of Los Angeles is going to put money and resources into the hands of youth in Los Angeles. So during this panel, we will be asking questions about how youth needs will be prioritized. I'm going to pass it back to Giovanna.
Thank you, Yoko, for that wonderful intro. But before we really get started, let's meet some of these panelists. Let's meet who we're going to be talking to. I'm going to ask all the panelists now to give us their name, their pronouns, what they do, and to shout out one young person in their life that they think is absolutely inspiring. Michelle, would you like to start?
For sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Good evening, everyone, and to our powerful youth leaders tuning in. My name is Michelle Benavides, pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the campaign lead for the Investing Youth Campaign, which is a youth-led coalition made up of youth leaders across the city and over 65 plus youth-serving organizations in the city of Los Angeles. And we are advocating for the past 7 years to create the city's first ever inclusive and holistic youth development department. We've been doing awesome work and working very closely with Councilwoman Monica Rodriguez, who has supported and believed in us since the beginning. We've also been working with Councilwoman Nithya Raman, the Youth Development Task Force, to ensure that our city creates a long-term vision and plan for our city's 800,000 youth so they can have the resources that they want and need in order for them to reach their full potential. And right before I pass over the mic, I just wanted to mention for those that haven't heard the news yet, after many years of organizing and advocacy, we're finally a step closer to reaching our goal, because as of April 1st of this year, Mayor Eric Garcetti announced that he will be allocating 1.1 million from his 2021 budget to 2022 budget to start the initial process to create a youth development department. So woo, that's super historic news, and it's a step forward in the right direction for our city. And real quick, like, this is why we need y'all to join our efforts and be a part of the conversation. And my shout out to the youth would be to the incredible youth leader, Monica Rodriguez, who is on this panel, and my talented youth organizer, Cassandra. Thank you so much.
Oops. I think we unmuted the wrong Monica Rodriguez. I'm Councilwoman Monica Rodriguez, but I know we have Monica Rodriguez squared here tonight because we also have a youth leader that is part of the Youth Development Task Force who was appointed by Mayor Garcetti. Just so happens she also is a Monica Rodriguez, but I'm Councilwoman Monica Rodriguez. I represent the 7th District, and I'm honored to be a part of this moment. I want to thank all of you. I thought, Yoko and Giovanna did an outstanding job setting up the stage for our conversation tonight. But to your point, the youth voices of the city need to be heard and reflected in the decisions that are being made in local government. It's why I joined and became the champion for the creation of a youth development department beginning back in 2018. And it's because of the inspiring work and the tenacity of youth leaders led by the Michelle Benavides of the world and Monica Rodriguez, and all of the work that has ensued since the creation of the Youth Development Task Force. We are finally at a moment where the city, where the Mayor Garcetti, at being persistent, we have petitioned him to make this a priority in his budget, and he responded. And I'm very proud of that work. But we didn't achieve it alone, and it was certainly a testimony to the incredible voices and organization of young people here in the city, and our decisions are being reflected by that. I wanted to just, there are a number of young people that inspire me. And Michelle knows the individual that I want to make reference to, but I think all the young people that have been associated with this movement to create a youth development department have inspired me, and I have a great many examples. But Karina Lison, who is from the Ramona Gardens community, is someone who I have tremendous admiration and respect for. Tragically, her father had been killed when she was young, and I met her when she was participating in Legacy LA's leadership development program when I was serving as a commissioner on the Board of Public Works. And I challenged those young people that they should demand more. I remember they were talking to me about how they could convert an alley in the area to a safe walk space for them to traverse from their neighborhood to the local park. And they were very indifferent and unsure of themselves, but I challenged them and I said, you need to come in forcefully and with the expectation that these are the types of things that you're deserving of. You have to really use your voice. And Karina, I was so proud of her because she took that as a challenge, and since has gone, taken some of the traumatic experiences of her life, like so many young people have had in our city, but really has just launched a trajectory of success for herself, getting a job with MRCA. She's committed to becoming a park ranger. She went off to Cal State Northridge to get her degree. She's been diligent in pursuing and recognizing that her voice matters. And I'm really proud of how she's really ascended in her own journey. And she's someone that I wanted to recognize this evening. And so I believe I'm going to kick it over now to our youth Monica Rodriguez, the younger Monica Rodriguez. It's good to see you. Turn it over to you.
It's good to see you too. So good evening, everyone. I'm the youth leader, Monica Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm currently attending St. Mary's Academy, but I recently just committed to USC. I was one of the 2 youth appointees to the Youth Development Task Force. And for those of you who may not know, this is a body of people appointed by the mayor and city council to develop a blueprint for what a youth department would look like based on community needs here in Los Angeles. I still work alongside the Youth Advisory Board and in the Invest in Youth campaign to continue to make sure that youth voices are heard and that their needs are met through the new Youth Development Department. I just want to give a quick shout out to those of you at Legacy LA, especially Michelle and Cassandra, especially for helping me adjust to the responsibilities as a youth appointee on the task force, and just overall for the incredible work that they've done, from arranging youth power town halls to organizing social media campaigns. So now I'll just turn it over to Councilperson Nithya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me tonight. My name is Nithya Raman. Pronouns are she, her, and I am a newly elected councilperson in the city of Los Angeles. I represent the 4th district. Before I became a candidate and before I became a councilperson, I actually ran an organization called Time's Up Entertainment, which worked on reducing sexual harassment and improving workplace safety for women and gender non-binary folks in the entertainment industry. And I have spent most of my career before then working on urban poverty issues. We were asked about a youth, someone who inspired us. And I was thinking about that question a lot. And I remember that the first time that I realized the potential of youth to be leaders in social change was actually in my work in India. In India, when I was working there, many of the slums, many of the low-income neighborhoods made up of informal housing were under threat of eviction by city governments there. And I remember in one particular neighborhood, there was a youth leader named Anita who made some of the most fierce arguments around protecting that neighborhood because she wanted to preserve her own future in that city. She wanted to preserve a piece of that future for herself. And in her work and in the work that I see of young climate activists today here in America, and particularly in Los Angeles, in the work of those youth who are fighting for this youth development department, and that I'm so proud to stand alongside today and in council, in the work I see in LA of so many young people. I feel like we are seeing a new emergence of youth fighting for their own futures. And I'm really excited to be here to learn more about the work that all of you are doing and to participate in this conversation.
Wow, those are some pretty powerful answers. Thank you so much, panelists, for all of the people that you shouted out, all of the work that you guys have been doing. I'm going to start this off with our first question. Obviously, here at Peace Over Violence, we focus on domestic and sexual violence, and we know that it comes in many different forms. One may be homelessness. Within the first 72 hours of being homeless, you are more likely to be trafficked, obviously. And then another factor that can contribute is schools upholding rape culture and poverty and just overall lack of resources for survivors. So my question for everyone here is, in what ways have you seen domestic and sexual violence impact your community? Youth Development Department, Monica, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to start us off. So domestic and sexual violence has definitely affected and impacted my community, and it's especially prevalent within youth in school and underrepresented communities. So many times in schools, there's no coordination between city or council services for students to access any of these resources. So it gets lost. And most of the time, a lot of these resources that are needed throughout these communities are like mental health services. And this has been evident when a lot of community members don't know where to access these kinds of resources or services. And then you have an added layer of cultural or religious beliefs that can ultimately prevent someone from reaching out for help. So in my personal experience, as a Mexican, I was always taught that people who were like depressed, or people who, you know, cried out that they were being abused, that they were just attention seekers, and that there was no reason to be acting that way or to be sad. And if they were struggling, then they should just turn to God and pray. So being able to educate community members, especially those who are from underrepresented communities, through these coordinations between the school and county and city resources, is just the first step to making any impact throughout our community. And sometimes schools are even at fault for perpetuating rape culture, policing, homelessness, poverty, and just so many other issues prevalent throughout our community. And one example of this is through the double standards of dress code aimed at girls when they're told how to dress or to cover up their shoulders. And this just continues to stigmatize that certain clothing equals promiscuity, or that it can be the reason behind a sexual assault.
You know, I can talk about how the issue of sexual violence, sexual assault is linked up with homelessness, which is an issue that I have talked about a lot, that I talked about a lot during my campaign, and that I deal with constantly in the work that I'm doing at the city. Sexual assault, sexual violence, I think, is both a cause of homelessness and an effect of homelessness. And I think it's an incredibly important thing to think about in addressing our response to homelessness. According to a recent study from the Downtown Women's Center, 42% of women who are experiencing homelessness report that they have been sexually assaulted in their lifetimes, and nearly a third experience sexual assault just in the previous year. And there is an incredibly high correlation between those who have experienced sexual assault, the trauma that results from sexual assault, and a later experience of homelessness. And so, you know, while it's incredibly important to make sure that we are responding to homelessness with services, with shelter, with housing that meets people where they are, that makes sure that people are able to quickly and effectively get off of the streets, I think it's just as important to understand when you are working with people who are experiencing homelessness that a lot of the challenges that they may be facing have to do with sexual violence in their own lives and the trauma that they've been facing. And that the work that we do in responding to homelessness actually has to be trauma informed and has to take this into account as a result.
Thank you so much, Councilman Rahman, for bringing this important issue up. And, you know, from my experience, I have personally seen domestic and sexual violence come in many different forms, both in physical and psychological abuse. I grew up in the Ramona Gardens housing development here in Boyle Heights. And as a youth, a lot of times our young people and community residents don't know where to find these much needed resources, or they might not know who to turn to when they're ready to speak up or seek support when dealing with the traumatic experience. Unfortunately, that could play a huge role in having a continuous cycle of abuse because folks don't have a safe space to turn to, or they don't have access to the immediate care and services that they need. We even see in our schools, like I believe Monica mentioned it, our schools sometimes, you know, don't have a centralized coordination between the city and county services. So our students could be left out from those services. Oftentimes for me, you know, growing up as a youth, trying to find access to these services, I felt like it was like a scavenger hunt. I was trying to, you know, search and find these limited resources to be able to, you know, support me and my community. And the reality is that a lot of our underrepresented communities go underserved, and that plays a huge part, especially when we talk about the impacts of domestic and sexual violence. We also see it affect our youth and community members both in their social life and their economic life. Additionally, there are barriers and concerns that are unique to us, communities of color, and we often face the lack of culturally appropriate services, as well as prevention and supportive resources in our, in our language. And I think something that I also notice in my community is that oftentimes we're not included in the conversations when they're saying what kind of programs we need in our communities. And this leads to us not getting the programming and services that our folks need. And each youth and survivor have their own experience and they all have different needs. So it's important that we highlight those folks and we include, our LGBTQ youth, our DACA youth, our youth who are experiencing homelessness, our Black and Brown youth, and our survivors in these conversations.
Well said, Michelle. And I think Nithya also cited many of the challenges that we are experiencing for individuals that have suffered from domestic violence and the percentages of women that have been left most vulnerable as a result of that. It has triggered the largest numbers of our homelessness population. And so it's for that reason that I actually partnered with the county to open up an all-women bridge home facility in my district in the community of Stillmar, because we know that women experiencing homelessness, the majority of whom are living in homelessness as a result of trying to escape the violence. And as a result of even just this pandemic, we know that sadly, how many individuals were frankly not reporting or trapped with a lot of their abusers. And so it's for that reason that I led an effort to create a system with Los Angeles Police Department where families would have that comfort level to report, the incidents related to some of the abuse that was happening, because we know that there has been underreporting of many of those issues for folks across our city. And to Monica's point is that culturally we have difficulties to overcome, and it's not really limited to the Latino community, although we see a great deal of that. We've tried to create an environment that enables everyone to feel comfortable, that we have culturally appropriate and sensitive means of connecting individuals. But the truth of the matter is that we know that the demand is far greater than what we've delivered in meeting that need. And we need to continue to do more. And that's the moment that we're in right now. I think we're going to be continuing to expand those efforts so that we can help meet people where they are, because we need to help address these problems, because before they become insurmountable or people find themselves living unsheltered as a result. And it's a collective community effort where we also have to make sure that we are sharing that data, sharing those resources with family members. We've been, I'm proud to have partnered with Peace Over Violence and a number of organizations in the past so that we can continue to share that information and let folks know that there is support and there is help, and we have to do more.
I love all of these responses. You are all so brilliant and doing the work. This is amazing. Thank you. This first question was amazing. Now we have the second question that is kind of a continuation. So, historically marginalized people like queer and Black, Indigenous people of color, those who have interacted with the carceral system, and those with disabilities are at higher risks of assault. So my question to all of you is, how are you centering marginalized survivors in the work you do? Can we start off with Michelle?
For sure. Thank you so much for leading us into the second question. So for us, it's definitely about making space to those that have been excluded from these conversations. And all the work that I have been a part of with the Invest in Youth campaign and with the Youth Development Task Force, it's always about genuinely centering the voice. We do it in many different ways because we want youth and community members to reclaim their voice, to reclaim their story without being tokenized. And that's really something crucial, because a lot of times our survivors are tokenized to share their stories. And that's something that we want to stay away from, because we have a real genuine interest to uplift their voices, to uplift their stories, and empower them to do so with the tools that they need to do it, and that's the key part of transformation, especially in our community. And in all the work that we do, we always like to make sure that it goes directly to the most impacted people. So the people that are most impacted should be the ones that are, doing the policy work, that are pushing for legislation to be made, because they're the ones that are oftentimes excluded. What I love the most about what I do in my job is that I love to hear the youth give their public comment, because they're sharing their story and reclaiming their story. And when we give public comment, we always like to make sure that all youth experiences are being heard. And if the city is not letting us be heard, then we'll definitely let them know. We're calling them up through public comment. We're like calling up their district offices to make sure that their voices are being heard. And a perfect example of how to uplift youth voices is doing it in a process that includes everybody. And I believe that the Youth Development Task Force Blueprint is a perfect example of how that was done. We had several listening sessions across the city, virtually, with over 120 folks joining our sessions. We had youth-led town halls, Youth Development Task Force meetings, where we really encouraged folks to give public comment. We did youth surveys, and we got to hear from over 600 plus LA youth and what their needs are and what their wants are. Because if we create a department without hearing from what they need and from what they want, then the department's not going to be successful, right? But if we're hearing from the folks who are needing these resources firsthand, then that's a different story. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it on over to our next person.
I think that's me. So, this is such an important question. I think it is so important to have voices of impacted communities in policymaking. In the work that I did during the campaign, we did this, we were able to do this particularly during the primary in person. What we did was we reached out to groups and individuals who were directly impacted residents, directly impacted communities, members of organizations that had been leading the work on it. And as we were putting together our policy platform for the campaign, we actually invited all of these individuals into the room to talk about what policies mattered for them and how we could center their experiences in the policies that we were actually putting together through the campaign. And it was an incredibly enriching and rewarding experience, and I think led us to be able to produce a policy platform during the campaign that was far richer than what I saw in, around me, and kind of the debates that were going on in discussions around city-based issues. And I think that richness, the ability to respond directly to communities, came because we had those people, those directly impacted voices in the room. One of the most exciting versions of that conversation actually happened when we talked to youth experiencing homelessness. And we were able to have people who brought their lived experiences of being youth who had experienced homelessness to the table and talk specifically about the kinds of resources that youth need in order to be able to transition out of homelessness. So one thing that came out from that conversation that was so fascinating for me was this idea of creating spaces that were like drop-in centers, that were places that were welcoming, that weren't shelters, that weren't interim housing, that weren't long-term housing, but just spaces where youth who felt disconnected from their communities and had been living on the streets could come and feel welcomed. And that those spaces were so essential to ensuring that these youth were able to start their journey into homelessness. I happened to visit a space like this called Safe Place for Youth out in Venice. And it was beautiful and welcoming and colorful and full of activities and life. And even during the pandemic, welcomed over 100 people to that site to come and use those resources and to start their journeys back into a home. And I feel like I would never have realized the importance of having that kind of space as part of a policy platform had I not to talk directly to impacted youth.
I believe I'm up. And I think, Michelle and Nithya have already really nailed it, is the circumstances of what everyone's experience is unique, and it's not always consistent across all the different groups of survivors. And depending on what the needs are with respect to the LGBTQ community and survivors of abuse in that regard, to what domestic violence survivors might need, it needs to be culturally appropriate to the meeting the individual's needs. And the truth is that as policymakers, our job is, we're not always the subject matter experts. And I think it's really important to be partnering and bringing in the organizations and the voices, the Peace Over Violence, the youth organizations, the youth voices, or the individuals that are being impacted. Their voice helps to inform how we respond. And that is critical to the success and actually meeting the needs of these individuals with this lived experience. And that's the responsibility that we have. As I mentioned earlier, when we were in the midst of this pandemic and we knew that survivors were trapped with their abusers, we talked to Peace Over Violence to identify what would be some additional ways where we can help create the safe space for individuals to get the help that they need. And so I think it's critical that we continue to open the doors and make available the opportunity for individuals to be able to express what their needs are in a manner that government and agencies will help to capture it and make sure that it's widely accessible. Because in my district, for example, and here in the San Fernando Valley, we don't have a variety of resources that have always been made available for some of these social concerns that so many families have experienced and some of the difficulties that they're experiencing. And so we have to do a better job of willing to expand the access to the resources that will help people survive these circumstances and actually put themselves on a trajectory for a better life outcome.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much for asking that question, because a lot of the time us youth, we aren't included in the work. In fact, sometimes we're told you're too young to know what you're talking about. And there's that ageism that's there. And one of the things that I loved most about being part of the task force was that my voice and the voice of other youth were always listened to. This work was and will always be about listening to those who are most impacted, including them in these conversations. We center these voices by giving youth the power to tell their stories and the power to be a part of the decisions that impact them. What I love most about the report we made for the task force was that it explicitly listed that youth voices of all populations would be included in those decision-making powers. So this includes youth who are bi POC, those who are part of the LGBTQ community, who are parents and caregivers who are experiencing mental health challenges, substance abuse, homelessness, and you just have this entire list of different populations of youth who will be included in these conversations. One of our slogans in the Investing Youth campaign is no more conversations about us without us. And as a youth representative on the task force, I help push youth decision-making powers in policies that will ultimately impact us the most. By including youth in these conversations and giving them these kinds of powers, we're ensuring that the marginalized are centered in every conversation. In addition to these powers, we've also outlined services requested by youth in these recommendations for the new youth department to make sure that their needs are being met.
Wow, these responses. Thank you, Monica. Both Monicas. I'm actually from the San Fernando Valley as well, so I definitely like that you were just talking about the issues within the community. I deeply resonated with all of your answers. And for our next question, we're going to focus a little bit on something that we learned at Peace Over Violence. During the Summer Institute, we made a big point of learning that underrepresented communities go unsupported. So my question is, how do you guys ensure that you are representing all voices within your district? This question is targeted toward the council people, obviously, because you guys have districts. So I'm going to start this off by asking Monica Rodriguez to answer.
Thank you, Giovanna. And, you know, we also have to remember, because of the challenges of what underrepresented communities struggle to participate in having that access, is one of the biggest challenges and hurdles that we face. Many people, I think, take for granted when you consider how the demands of people's day-to-day life, what that entails, makes it very difficult for them to be engaging in local neighborhood councils or those types of efforts. I've tried to make it a point. I created a youth council of my own in my district. I've created several local efforts to address both homelessness. I have a homelessness task force. I have an equestrian. You know, we have a number of groups whose voices have never been considered in conversations with respect to the issues that are impacting a great number of people. And so for me, it's been with a lot of intention of trying to bring additional voices in, many of whom are individuals that have never been directly engaged in local government. But the truth is what informs the work that we do has so much to do with sometimes the voices that are not always available to participate in this public process. And so we also have to be mindful, and the data will always reflect that. If you look at even what happened through the course of the pandemic, my district was ground zero for the highest number contraction rates of COVID-19. The resources that we needed in these areas far outpaced the resources that might be needed in other areas, because many members in my community, they are those essential workers that don't have the luxury, for example, to be able to work from home on a Zoom. They would not have the resources otherwise to keep a roof over their head for their families or keep their families fed. It's why we saw the tremendous spike in need, for example, in expanding food pantries in this area. So oftentimes it's a lot of just the experience of families proactively, and we proactively reached out to a number of our vulnerable communities, particularly our seniors, for example, but reaching out to everyone far and wide to be as communicative and as engaging to incorporate their needs into the policy making that we were doing in these situations. And that's been the model of how I've continued to approach it, even preceding the pandemic. We know that it has kind of really stifled our ability to engage in an in-person manner. But if you look at what we did, for example, with the Youth Development Task Force, I think that's another great example of how we were able to reach a much wider audience to ensure that what we were making, the decisions that we were going to pursue as policymakers, was inclusive of voices that had never been reflected in these decisions before. And so it's with that intentionality that I continue to lead efforts in my district to make sure that we're availing resources and doing the work that is actually meeting the needs of the people that we serve.
Yeah, this is such a great question. I think in part because of how, in many ways, Los Angeles City Council has been working for a long time. So in LA, we have had very few people participating in municipal elections for a very, very long time here. We have very low voter turnout in our local elections. And those few voters who have voted have had oversized influence on the policies and priorities that have come out of City Hall. And it turns out that often the people who are regularly voting in city council races, the most engaged voters, these also happen to be the most resourced people in Los Angeles. So these are homeowners, they are wealthier, they are not representative of the incredible diversity of this city. And for many, many years, a lot of the policy making that came out of City Hall, especially when you had council people who weren't making the effort to go out to communities, who weren't necessarily proactively reaching out already to council members, the policy making that was coming out of City Hall really centered the needs of a smaller group of residents rather than the needs of all Angelenos, who I think have a very different set of needs than say just a small minority of homeowners in a city which is, for example, majority renters. So in our campaign in this past over the past year and a half before I got elected, in the primary, we tried to break down some of the natural barriers that existed between people who didn't traditionally participate in local municipal politics and the kinds of things that we were talking about for city policies. And we did that physically. We actually went and knocked on doors in apartment buildings, even though often renters weren't voting in elections. We went out and knocked on their doors anyway and talked to them about city policies and said, hey, there is a rent stabilization ordinance. Did you know that your rents are limited year on year to increase? Did you know that you have these rights available to you? And if you didn't realize all of this, then you're not leaning on the city enough for support. And we would like to be the kind of city council office that really comes out proactively to you, tells you what your rights are, tells you what you're entitled to. And we were able to do that physically during the primary. During the general election, obviously, we weren't able to do that. And since I've taken office, we've been limited in those kinds of physical canvassing and door knocking efforts by the pandemic. But now, as we're exiting out of this period of the pandemic, I think we have the opportunity to do that kind of proactive outreach again, to not just sit in City Hall and make policy decisions, but to actually go out and tell people, hey, here are the policies that we've put together to help you. We want to make sure that you're availing yourself of these resources. We want to make sure that you know about these resources. And we're really, really excited to start doing that again, even in this period of the pandemic. One thing that our office did just in the brief time that I've already been in office is to do phone banks to residents in the district so that they were basically able to know about things like the eviction moratorium, to know about things like vaccine access, to learn more about how they could get tested if they needed to make sure that they were aware of all of the resources that the city and the county and the state had made available for them. And we did that through a proactive volunteer-led phone banking operation that reached many, many residents across the district as well. But I'm excited now to do that physically again.
Thank you for your responses, council people, Monica and Nithya. I actually want to give Nithya, I want to give you these last couple minutes because I know you do have to leave at 6:45. I would like you to use this time, if you would like, to make any final remarks.
Well, I just wanted to extend my deepest gratitude to this group and to this group of young people who are taking on the biggest challenges facing Los Angeles and making sure that the city's policies reflect their needs, not just now, but many, many years into the future. For me, one of the most exciting things about this moment in kind of our national political landscape is how much more young people are engaged and participating. I think we've seen this most kind of vibrantly or rather most visibly across the country in the climate movement. And I think in Los Angeles, I want to see more of this work, not just around the creation of a youth development department, but actually for youth to step up and be involved in things like housing policy and be involved in things like tenants policies, because these are the issues that determine the terms on which you get to live in LA, to make sure that you're able to afford a home in LA and that you're able to thrive in Los Angeles. And these are issues that have for too long not had youth voices represented in it. So not just on climate, where it's so essential, but on all of the other challenges that Los Angeles is facing, the voices of youth are essential. And I am so excited to continue engaging with you and to make sure that we can center those voices in these conversations going forward. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Go do what you need to do. We know you have other responsibilities. You're out here adulting and we appreciate that. So, awesome. We have more questions because we're ready to get that knowledge. We're ready to learn so much more but also for us to inspire you. And hopefully the panelists in this Zoom get to take something away from us. So my question is directed towards everyone in the Zoom. So supporting youth can come in many forms, whether it be in mutual aid, grassroots organizing, education, or in listening to and incorporating youth voices and ideas. So my question is, what are the first steps in your process to supporting youth in LA? We can start off with youth, Monica.
So yeah, thank you so much. Some steps that we've already taken is influencing policy and legislation. So through the youth power town halls and social media campaigns, we've already made a huge impact, which is pretty evident through our new youth development department. We intend to continue our work to ensure that these deficits are met and other topics become a priority, like youth mental health. Another step within our process is ensuring that organizations that we work with or that work under the new youth development department are properly trained to provide quality services, and they offer programs that are tailored to the specific needs of the youth. And in addition to this, that cultural competency to make sure that they're aware of these stereotypes or cultural stigmas that ultimately inhibit youth from reaching out. As the youth department grows, we also want to make sure that the process of attaining these resources is so much easier to go through. So that's why we've requested a website with youth services and a youth hotline to be able to guide youth as they access these resources. And I know that this will be a huge first step in eliminating these barriers, because the majority of the youth that I've talked to have mentioned how frustrating it can be when they need to scroll through websites or click on other links, and they just end up right back where they started. I want to pass the mic over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Monica. And you covered a lot, So for me, like the first step is to create conversations with adults and elected officials and let them know that our young people are so powerful and they could create strong and empowering policy making. Our youth organizers and I have been in spaces where adults sometimes, they do a lot of ageism or adultism that is present in the meeting. So a lot of times we hear adults gaslighting us or telling us, you're just kids, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what life is about, or you haven't experienced anything, so you don't know what resources you need. But the reality is that we're not too young, we know exactly what our needs are, we know exactly what support our community needs, and youth are extremely talented and powerful, and with the right tools, we're able to organize and influence this long-term meaningful change in our communities. Youth are the experts of their experiences, and they are the best fit to influence policy and legislation that ensures that things like youth mental health are prioritized. We have, with having a centralized youth development department, our goal is to also ensure that there are organizations under the department that are adequately trained to ensure the quality and services that the community needs, and support the grassroots community organizations that are already doing this work, because there's many powerful organizations out there that are already working with youth and community. This department will also identify risk and resilient factors, creating a youth hotline, just like Monica said, and a website for you to be able to have direct access to the services that they need and have a place where they're able to go to. Because I know for me, it was very frustrating growing up, not knowing where I could get support. Like I would go to one department and they'll send me to different department and then to another department. That kind of discouraged me from even seeking help. So this will definitely help our youth and our communities. And also, having 24/7 open youth hubs for you to be able to go to these places if they don't feel safe at home. And I think the most important and transformational thing is creating leadership opportunities for our young people, because a lot of folks always like to say the youth are our future, but if we're not investing in our youth, then we're not going to have a bright future. So we need to equip our young people to lead this work and transform and empower their communities, both at the local level and national level. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to our councilwoman.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And I think both you and Monica, again, nailed it. But this is an important part of this whole conversation, is how do we assure that the decisions that are being made by policymakers is actually reflective and taking into account the voices of those that they purport to serve, right? We invest in programs all the time. And my biggest challenge and frustration has been we invest in greater policing efforts of the problems that emanate as a result of not making the investments in young people because we've never listened to their voices. And so the paradigm and that shift starts now. And I'm really, Shirley Chisholm said, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And one of the things that I did by the creation of a youth development task force was making sure that young people had a seat at the table. Because I didn't want adults to continue to be sitting around the table having conversations about what youth need. We have a suite, we have tons of offerings, program offerings that were not designed or informed by youth voices, but designed and informed by adults making decisions on what they thought youth need. And I think that's systemically been part of the problems that we've experienced. The work of the Youth Development Task Force has identified ways that we could do a much better job and much informed job of creating and availing programs, concierge services, if you will, for young people that are informed by the experience and what they need. And so that is most important in all of this. I think, for me, this initial creation of a youth development department, the creation of a citywide youth council is another initiative that I've led, in addition to the youth council that I created here in my own district. Because creating the space for young people to actually learn how to constructively engage in government process is also really important. And those aren't things that you're going to learn just by going to school. You have to engage in that process, but we have to create that space for you. And so creating a citywide youth council is something that I'm leading and to create here in the city of Los Angeles as well, because I don't want this to be a one-time occurrence. I want it to be a sustained voice in how we develop policy in the city. And it should be informed by the very people that it purports to serve. And so again, for me, it's about intentionality and creating that space and making sure that we create the opportunity for young people to have a seat at the table, to help be an influencer and help change the policies that are and inform the policies that are being made in the city here in our city. And I think that work needs to continue to grow to make an impact both at the higher levels of government as well.
Thank you so much again for your wonderful answers, ladies. This next question is going to be geared again to the youth representatives from the developmental force here. So obviously, like as teenagers, we've seen this in our high school administrations. We've seen this in districts. Over the last few years, we've seen many high schools and the administration teams and even the districts turn a blind eye to sexual harassment and so on their campuses. A lot of you guys have touched upon this, but how do you think the youth developmental department can work to incorporate teen dating violence / youth sexual violence awareness and prevention within their program? I'd like to start off with Monica.
Thanks. So definitely one of the things that we touched upon earlier was creating these 24/7 youth hubs that young people can go to if they ever need a safe space outside her home. So I had a classmate who was a former foster kid, and she went as far as joining clubs and sports after school just so she could stay at school a little bit longer. She didn't feel safe at home, and I know that if she had one of these, hubs, that there would have been a significantly better outcome for her. And that's how I know that, this department and these hubs will be the first step in providing that safe space and accessible resource hub for a lot of these people who are suffering from sexual or domestic abuse. I also know that, part of this department will protect youth from their abusers by helping them get their addresses made private, so that way their abusers don't have access to their whereabouts, and also ensuring that these youth have what they need. So listening to what they specifically need in order to fulfill those deficits that aren't met by other resources. And the Youth Development Department would also allow for youth to empower themselves via decision-making power within the department. So one of the things that was proposed was having youth representatives who will have the power to influence and vote on policies. We've also mentioned having peacekeepers as part of the department, and we want to train and hire youth who already live within those communities to act as peacekeepers, because they experience firsthand what it's like to live within that neighborhood and understand these situations firsthand. So continuing to work and also hire community-based organizations is also another step that we intend to take, because they've already done the work, they've already worked within these communities, and they understand what these communities need. We've also we're also intending to offer financial resources, community networks, and even leadership programs, partnerships to address community needs and issues with companies. And also the most important step that we're taking is trauma-informed services. So these services would ultimately be used to educate others about the experiences of youth and the stigma surrounding outreach within these communities in order to better provide services and outreach. And I want to pass over the mic to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Monica. Monica hit a lot of the key points from our department and our goals for the department. So this department can also ensure that youth have access to all the resources that they need at the time that they need it without having to be looking around for the services. If our youth know that there is a central location to find these services, then this is a game changer because it could literally save lives. A lot of the time we need access right then and there, and we shouldn't be wasting time. So if we have a central department, that's definitely a game changer for a lot of our youth in our city. The department would also equip our youth with the tools that they need to know what sexual violence and dating violence even is. There's youth who might not even know what dating violence is, and it could be even tougher to reach out to folks if you have a partner who is, giving you gaslighting comments. So having a department that also makes education accessible is definitely a step towards prevention, and it also creates a community and network for survivors to also feel that they have family and they have support out there. And with this department, we also want to ensure that resources exist and are accessible to the community, and that we also have centers that focus on dating and sexual violence, and expanding the access to marginalized communities that don't have access to these programs are super key. And Monica also mentioned 24/7 youth hubs. And if we have a department that is focusing on youth, then the funding that is focused on youth should be adequately and be held accountable on the spending. So we want that the funding for this department to, also go towards doing programming that is available for youth that are impacted by dating violence and sexual violence. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to the MC.
Yes, MC in the Zoom, I'm here. So this is the final question specifically to Councilperson Monica. And after you answer this question, you can give your final thoughts and then hop off the Zoom, because I also know that you're adulting and you have other responsibilities as well. So this final question for Councilperson Monica is, the Youth Development Department was formed and funded to serve and support the youth of Los Angeles. For decades, and most recently, young people have led movements that demand the abolition of institutions that are harmful to them and survivors of sexual violence. They demand the abolition of police, prisons, and juvenile detention centers. So my question for you is, how are you empowering and continuing the work that these young people are doing?
Thank you so much. And, it's been a real pleasure to be a part of this panel and join you all in this work and this continued fight. I'm going to wrap my question up with my close and my answer. And I just, I want to say that, again, it's by creating the space for the young people to have a voice in influencing public policy.
I've done that by creating the Youth Development Task Force that was helping to really fight for the transformation of the governance for how we offer programming here in the city of Los Angeles. We've accomplished a major first step by not just creating the Youth Development Task Force, but by being able to influence a dramatic change in the city in how we govern and offer programs, and potentially impact and transform the program offerings that are made available in the city of Los Angeles. That's never happened before. There's always been some form of youth programs, and in the city of Los Angeles, we have 26 different departments that are offering programs related to youth. But no centralized vision, no accountability, no measurements, no metrics. And we don't just, and you know, we offer these programs, but to what degree? Is it widely available to young people across this city? And we know that it's not. But because we've never had that level of accountability by having a centralized entity. And so that is a big part of why we're doing this. Creating the citywide youth council to help be involved and opining and being involved in decision making and influencing those conversations will be an important part of this as well. When we talk about all the variety of issues, from policing to housing, those are the voices that need to be incorporated in how we affect policy in the city. And we've never had a formal environment that enabled that voice to be present, to have that influence. And so for me, it's been very important, and it's derived, frankly, and I want to just close on this note. You know, when I joined the Invest in Youth Coalition at the announcement where Mayor Garcetti announced that he was making the commitment to fund the creation of a youth development department, I showed up as the 16-year-old self, the 16-year-old from San Fernando High School who was protesting the budget cuts that were being made to arts programs and the programs that mattered to so many of us. There was preservation of the typical sports programs because those were a benefit and those were deemed beneficial and important, but arts was not. And so as someone who had a great passion and outlet in arts and music, I was very frustrated and angry that our voices were never heard. And we organized and we mobilized and we marched. But it's in the persistence of changing those policies and making sure that we don't ever see ourselves back in those situations again that matters. And so it was with that intentionality that I've done this work to make sure that young people had that space. Because as a 16-year-old, I remember how frustrated I was that I was not heard, and that my peers, how frustrated we were to see the things that we cared about stripped away, and being told by those adults that we didn't know better and that we didn't know what we were talking about. Well, you know what? That was our life that they were making decisions about. And so it's for those reasons that many times I show up as that 16-year-old self to remind myself in the work that I do today that those and what led me to champion this cause for the young people of our city is because their voices do matter. And our government should create the space for them to have that voice to help inform the decisions that we make. We shouldn't silence them. We shouldn't placate them. They need to be incorporated and represented in everything that we do, because our job is to help every young person in this city achieve their full potential. And we're not going to stymie them by telling them that they don't know what they're talking about. They know exactly what they're talking about. And it's their lived experience that will benefit more young people, not just in this generation, but for generations to come. And so I'm really proud to be a partner in that and to continue to champion those efforts, because here in the city of Los Angeles, we're going to change how business is getting done. So I've been proud to be an ally in that fight, and will continue to be alongside all of you all in this continued effort for our city. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a real privilege to be with you all this evening.
The honor is ours. Thank you so much. And then there were two. We're gonna wrap up with the rest of the panelists. We want to again to thank all of our council people, but fitting with the theme, we're here to talk about the youth. We're here to uplift young voices like Monica's and Michelle's. And it's kind of funny to think that we're all about the same age and we're all doing so much work individually. And I like that we've talked a lot about ageism and the ageism that you face being in political spaces. So for our next and final question, I want to ask all of you, what has been the process? What's the process been like creating the youth developmental department? I know this has been an amazing experience and it's really exciting, but if you want to talk about some of the challenges you face and the roles you and other young people will be playing over the next upcoming years. Michelle, why don't we start with you?
For sure. And thank you so much for that question because it definitely allows me to have, a moment of reflection. I started off with the Invest in Youth campaign when I was a senior in high school. So that was back in 2014. So it was literally just a group of like a few youth from our youth council here in Boyle Heights. And we just started, thinking of like, hey, like there's not enough resources in our communities. Like we need more resources for the youth. And our executive director over at Legacy LA was like, all right, then start organizing, start getting connected with other organizations, other youth, and start a coalition. So we said, all right, bet. And that's what we did. We started off with just a few organizations in Boyle Heights. And then we quickly started connecting with folks over in South LA, the Valley, West LA, and even MacArthur Park area because youth are not just facing issues in Boyle Heights, right? Youth are facing issues across the city of Los Angeles. And when we first started off, it was just like 5 organizations. And now fast forward to 7 years later, I finally got an opportunity. I graduated college, I worked hard. I graduated college and now I came back as not as a youth organizer, but now as the campaign lead of the coalition. So it just goes to show what leadership opportunities and what providing youth with the right adequate tools that they need to be empowered and fill up these leadership roles could do to not only my community but to the city, because now we have a pipeline of leaders starting off as youth organizers to now have a role as like campaign lead. So Councilman Monica Rodriguez was talking about the day of the rally, and at the day of the rally, it was just so like rewarding and empowering to see that all our years of hard work finally got to happen. We finally now have the funding to help create our department. And it wasn't easy, right? When I remember being a senior in high school and we were going to City Hall with like all our posters, and we had council members tell us like, this is never gonna happen, it's not gonna work. And we're like, whatever, we're still going to continue doing what we're going to do because we believe that the youth voice needs to be heard and be included in the political arena, and we need youth services and we need to be able to advocate for that. And we never gave up, and now look at us now 7 years later making this possible. But this is just the beginning, because now the real work begins, because we are going to have our youth department, but we need to make sure that we are super key when it comes to the implementation process, because we want to make sure that everything that we included in the Youth Development Task Force report is honored in that department, because the youth have spent like years doing listening sessions, doing town halls, doing youth surveys to hear what the youth want and need. So we want to make sure that that's implemented in the department. But it was tough, man. It was definitely tough, but it just goes to show that youth are doing the hands-on work. And I remember going to a grad school presentation, and I was really nervous to present about the work we were doing. I was like, these are grad students, they're not going to take me seriously, I'm a high school student. And the professor came up to me and he was like, you're doing the work that a lot of these students are studying to do. And I always tell my youth organizers that, because oftentimes as a young person you might feel intimidated being in these spaces, but you're doing this hard work because you care and because you're a leader in your community. And with that, I'll pass it over to Monica.
Thank you, Michelle. That's definitely gonna be a hard act to follow. But from my own experience, I loved working with the Youth Development Task Force. Despite me joining, months later on the last leg of the race, everyone was super welcoming and always willing to help me adjust to my responsibilities as a youth advocate. And they always answered any of the questions I had about presentations or proposals. I definitely felt heard, and I know that all of our youth voices were heard, because almost all of the needs or concerns that the youth had were included in these task force recommendations. I was at a handful of listening sessions as well as youth advisory board meetings, where I saw data points and heard stories about the deficits a lot of the youth face and encounter. These deficits were recognized and addressed in the recommendations. And this was really historic, not only for, our community, but also for youth, because this was one of the first task forces that actually included youth representatives. And I was able to help write these reports and recommendations. So that inclusion of youth was really a huge milestone for us. And I really hope to follow in like Michelle or Cassandra's footsteps as a community leader. And I definitely want to continue working alongside the Youth Advisory Board, the Investing Youth Campaign, and maybe end up working with Legacy LA. But I definitely want to continue, fighting for these resources, especially for underrepresented communities, and make my mark and be able to, give back to my own community. And thank you so much for having me here. Passing it back to the MCs.
Thank you, everyone. This has been such an amazing day. We are going to close out, but before we do, I did want to remind everyone that we will be following up with all of the panelists just to make sure that they're doing the work and how we can be more involved in that process. But thank you all so much. I hope audience members, either in the Zoom as panelists or on YouTube, I hope you took something away, and I hope you share that with someone. These conversations, the answers, the responses, everything has been so magical. So thank you all so, so much. Have a great evening. Goodbye.